Paris will host a major political summit in February 2024. Imagine the most powerful leaders, largely Europeans and NATO members, meeting in a prestigious space to discuss global security. Two key purposes make the meeting historic and essential. Macron's NATO remarks. 1. It allows attendees to analyze Russia's recent advances in Ukraine, particularly the capturing of Avdiivka, which hinders Ukraine's Donetsk efforts. What will such leaders do to support Ukraine against Russian invasion? 2. The meeting is designed to show unity with Ukraine and remind Vladimir Putin that his invasion won't be tolerated. Macron took both goals too literally. Despite the NATO members' attempts to balance their replies, he added, "No ground forces were officially supported. Nothing should be excluded. We will do everything we can to defeat Russia." Macron hinted in 3 phrases that NATO would send soldiers to Ukraine, a direct military move it has avoided. Macron's NATO counterparts were confused. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz tried to retract Macron's words, saying NATO ground soldiers would not enter Ukraine. The White House National Security spokesperson reiterated that President Joe Biden has stated that the U.S. will not send soldiers to Ukraine. Macron's minor fire should have been quenched immediately. Under strong pressure from his backers, Macron doubled down on his comments. He arrived at Paris's Olympic Village days after making these remarks to prepare for the 2024 Olympics. When questioned by reporters, he said the Ukraine conflict was serious. He stated every word he spoke was measured, weighed, and thought through, suggesting he has been considering pushing NATO into Ukraine. French military history. This video addresses 2 key questions. Why does Macron want France to enter Ukraine, and can he involve NATO by sending French troops? To understand Macron's motivations, we need to look at France's military history. France had a strong military legacy, reaching its peak under Napoleon, who expanded its colonial empire across Africa. However, after underestimating Prussia, France lost the 1870 war, ending its dominance and allowing Germany to rise as a power. In the 20th century, France suffered heavily. In World War I, it lost 14 million soldiers and 300,000 civilians, with 25% of the war's casualties. In World War II, France was conquered by Nazi Germany, leading to significant losses. 21,600 military deaths and 35,000 civilian deaths. France's military strength was severely weakened. Despite these setbacks, France maintained its colonial empire and focused on rebuilding. It joined the European Economic Community in 1957 and played a key role in NATO. Today, France ranks 11th in military strength, with 2,000 active personnel, 26,000 reserves, and significant air, naval, and ground forces. Macron wants to enter Ukraine. Why? One of just 9 nuclear nations in the world, it threatens all other nations with 290 nukes. Now you're probably wondering how this relates to NATO entering the Ukraine war. This brief history shows how France recovered from military humiliation to regain global relevance by forging partnerships and rebuilding its military. So did so, knowing that an aggressive nation that remains unchecked threatens not just the country it invades, but also many more. Germany conquered Poland and most of Europe in World War II before the Allies retaliated. Macron may be seeing something similar in Russia and Ukraine now. His remarks about deploying NATO troops into Ukraine to show France would confront Russian aggression suggest he sees the war as the start of something bigger. He may have wanted them to warn his NATO friends that defeating such a threat would need a coordinated display of force, allowing him to argue for NATO's active involvement in the conflict. By leading NATO intervention, Macron would be the first to propose direct action in Ukraine, highlighting France's peacekeeping role and geopolitical influence. Macron's words may have other causes besides those theoretical ones. France has many domestic issues that could have prompted Macron to propose NATO action in Ukraine. A nation in crisis over immigration is his problem. Around 700,000 asylum seekers and refugees live in France, according to the Permanent Mission of France to the UN in New York. It also donates $100.6 million to the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, which reinforces the idea that France builds itself by helping others. Unfortunately, a large far-right contingent opposes massive immigration. Macron introduced a controversial bill in January 2024 that was promptly passed and enforced certain immigration restrictions. This bill makes it harder for immigrants to bring their families to France and limits welfare payments. Worse, immigrants' children in France would no longer automatically become French citizens under Jusseline, or right of the land, but must petition for citizenship between 16 and 18. After its publication, 16,000 people marched in Paris and 75,000 countrywide to denounce the measure. France has accepted fewer Ukrainian refugees than any other EU country. France has admitted only 647,720 of the 4.3 million war refugees. That pales in comparison to Germany's 1.2 million refugees and Poland's 1 million. France accepts less than 1 Ukrainian refugee per 1,000 residents, compared to numerous EU countries that accept 25. How does this relate to France and NATO entering Ukraine? It indicates France is divided. Macron's February comments may have been an attempt to divert attention from the country's internal issues to his controversial policies toward a common enemy, Russia. He may also argue that addressing Russia now would reduce France's pressure to accept Ukrainian refugees, which would please his far-right party. We now have 2 reasons Macron may intervene in Ukraine: France's past, especially its defeat by European powers, and the immigration crisis may be factors. Wagner Group. The Wagner Group, though technically independent, exemplifies Russian military operations and is a key tool in advancing Russia's global influence, particularly in regions where Moscow avoids direct involvement, such as in Africa. France once held significant influence in Africa through its Francafrique system, maintaining cultural and political ties with its former colonies. However, recent Wagner Group activities are diminishing this influence. For example, in May 2022, Wagner replaced France's military presence in Mali, where France had spent 9 years combating terrorism. Despite initial success, France's intervention displaced 2.5 million Malians and strained relations, leading to the withdrawal of French forces in 2022. Wagner's arrival in Mali in December 2021, 6 months before France's departure, marked a shift toward Russian influence in the region. After the French forces left, Wagner strengthened ties with Mali's military junta. In addition, Wagner's presence in the Central African Republic in 2023 spurred disinformation campaigns against France, suggesting it orchestrated a mine assault to undermine Russia's efforts. While Francafrique is still present, its influence has waned over the past decade, and France's role in Ukraine may be driven by the need to counter Russian encroachment. President Macron questions who might follow Russia if it captures Ukraine, as Russia's advances in Ukraine signal a growing geopolitical shift. Macron, NATO, and Russia escalating European conflict. After receiving Western aid, Kyiv pushed back Russian forces and damaged the Black Sea Fleet. However, following a failed 2023 counteroffensive, Russia has gained territory. The situation in Avdiivka indicates a potential Russian victory unless Western intervention occurs. If Russia succeeds in Ukraine, it could extend its influence into Moldova, a NATO partner but not a member, which would not trigger NATO's Article 5 defense clause. Russia has been using hybrid tactics to destabilize Moldova, including disinformation campaigns and supporting pro-Russian opposition to President Maia Sandu. In 2023, Moscow spent $55 million to sway Moldovan elections and back pro-Russian groups. Moldova's National Security Service accuses Russian oligarchs of funding rallies. If these efforts fail, Russia may resort to force, especially after securing Ukraine. A successful Ukrainian campaign could allow Russia to replenish its forces and potentially launch an attack from the Moldova-Ukraine border. Putin knows NATO's response would likely be limited to financial and military support, as seen in Ukraine. Similarly, France faces similar challenges with hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, and disinformation, which may have contributed to Macron's acceptance of Russia's aggression. Macron may imply that when he says his comments on deploying NATO troops into Ukraine were well thought out. He's seeing Russia attack France unconventionally. He knows Moscow is eroding his country's influence in Africa and Europe. He may regard this as part of a NATO-wide campaign. Putin's willingness to target France suggests he's spreading disinformation and anger in other NATO members. One other problem may be pushing Macron to enter Ukraine: Donald Trump. Trump has regularly threatened to leave NATO if other members don't pay their share during his presidential campaign. Many in Europe take that threat seriously, even if it's false. According to Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft Research fellow Arten Desimonian, concerns about a second Trump presidency have brought Europeans up to the need to defend themselves. This insight may have given Macron the impetus he needed to seek strategic autonomy from the U.S. According to Al Jazeera, Macron wants to create a Europe that doesn't need Washington for defense. Macron's statements on deploying NATO soldiers into Ukraine may not have been addressed by all NATO members. Instead, they may have been a wake-up call to Europe to unite against an increasingly aggressive Russia. Although the U.S. is Russia's largest foe, Europe must deal with Putin in its backyard. Everything leads to a last inquiry. France's call for NATO involvement in the Ukraine conflict has been rejected by NATO allies. Most notably, Germany's Chancellor, U.S. President, UK Prime Minister, and NATO Secretary General denied any plans to send troops to Ukraine. Instead, Britain will focus on training Ukrainian soldiers. Macron's suggestion that NATO intervene was met with approval in Russia, with Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov warning of direct conflict if NATO engages. In March 2024, Putin dismissed claims of Russia attacking NATO, mocking Macron's call for a NATO response. France's hope of NATO allies supporting Article 5 in case of French intervention is uncertain, as it only applies to attacks on member states' territory. Macron believes NATO must act to stop Russia's aggression, seeing Ukraine as the first step in Putin's ambitions for Europe. He argues NATO should expel Russia from Ukraine to prevent broader instability. Additionally, Macron sees the growing Russian influence in Africa as a geopolitical threat, while also recognizing the domestic distraction caused by rising immigration. However, Macron's calls for action might require more than sending French troops to persuade other NATO nations to engage. And now, we want to hear from you. What do you think about the possibility of NATO intervening in Ukraine as Macron has suggested? Does a Russian victory in Ukraine pose a major threat to the rest of Europe? And are Macron's concerns about Russia's growing power justified? Share your views in the comments below. We look forward to reading your thoughts and analysis. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates from us.